It's great to have you with us. You're watching the Africa Leadership Dialogues. I'm Julie Gichuru. Now this week we speak to activist, musician, philanthropist Sir Bob Geldof. We get his thoughts on transformation in Africa. Plus, Africa's top 10. Stay with us. In 1984, the world was exposed to the images of a famine that had gripped Ethiopia a year earlier. Horrifying images of people dying of starvation. Musicians Bob Geldof and Gichuru came together in the UK to organize Live Aid in response to this crisis, to try and help out, to try and address the famine in Ethiopia. Decades later, we caught up with Bob in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Let's see what his thoughts are on the transformation of the African continent. Thanks so much, Bob, for making time to be with us.
Welcome.
This is profound. This is close to 30 years, 3 decades after Live Aid in the 80s. And we're here in Ethiopia. What's interesting is Ethiopia is now growing food for India. I mean, it's just a fascinating journey, but I'd like to know, what do you think about where Africa is right now, how far it has come?
I was in China in 1983, and I traveled down through China, and I looked out the window and just saw people in their Mao suits still. And when we arrived in Beijing, there was one car and millions of bicycles and one shop in this whole city. If you had told me then that this was the power and economy of the 21st century, I'd have gone, where? How? So now, a year later, I see what's happening in Ethiopia and the famine. And the objective was to stop people dying, as many people dying as possible. I thought it was hugely unnecessary. The world was rich. Why were 30 million people in the Sahel about to die? That's disgusting. And the thought wasn't that one day this will all be a booming continent. But once I started coming here and seeing how people survived and thrived in the most terrible circumstances, you can see the dynamism and the creativity and the intellectualism and the productivity of these people, how they could grow things in circumstances where people from my country couldn't grow a blade of grass. Then the potential was always there. And so, it rapidly became, in my mind, famine and hunger and lack of education and lack of health and conflict and corruption are only symptoms of a greater malaise, poverty. And poverty is economic and political. You can't get rid of it. And so the objective then, from my point of view and my friends, was we must attack it at its core. And that was what we've been doing. And I think that was the correct thing for us to do, to constantly argue for this point. And I think it came to a head in 2005 with Live Aid, where we'd taken this to the highest level, to the G8. And they agreed at that G8 to cancel the debt of the poorest countries. So if a country produced $100, it didn't leave that country, it stayed in that country to be invested. Where the world promised to double aid to Africa. Now, aid is not an answer, but it will stabilize at a very basic level of community. So if the money stays in the country, stabilizes at a very basic level, the next thing that's needed is investment. Nobody could have predicted the Chinese were going to come pouring into Africa to get the resources.
It's a scramble.
Yeah, to get the resources to power their economy, which is saving the planet, okay? And the other factor, which is critical, and where none of this would have worked really without the fourth factor, was connectivity, mobile connectivity. Because Africa is a very underpopulated continent. So there never could be hubs of development, because it's so huge. I mean, people truly don't understand how huge this continent is. I mean, you know, China, India, Europe, America, Australia just drop into this continent, don't leave a ripple. So being underpopulated, being vast, you couldn't get from one hub of development to another. There were no roads, no rail, no transit, so infrastructure. But with mobiles, suddenly you had connectivity, virtual infrastructure, money coming in from the Chinese initially. The countries keeping their own money through debt forgiveness and aid stabilising, boom, lift off.
And then trade.
But that was the point about trade. You know, once you got those conditions, you could start producing, trading, investment coming in from India and from the West. And so, and key to all of that were governments that had a focus on how to try and make this thing work. I mean, without a good governance, capital will only go where it's safe. So you needed leadership.
Right, we'll come back to the issue of leadership on the African continent. But let me ask you this very simple question. Why care? Even one right now, yourself, Bono, why care? And I ask this because there are a lot of young people who feel very disillusioned, hopeless even, not sure if they should bother or how far to go.
If you're a young African, there's no reason to be disillusioned. You might feel you're outside the loop right now. And I understand that there are thousands of kids watching this, or families, who've got nothing. And they're saying, look at Geldof going on about boom time. You know, we've got nothing. We're still back there. Our government's crap. You know, we can't get educated. We can't get health. What's he talking about? You know, I understand that great dissatisfaction, but that great dissatisfaction is a spur to governments to grow. And you need to get organised and to make them feel, sense and hear your frustration. I mean, and that's changing, and again, connectivity is changing it. I mean, one of our people in Africa gathered the farmers of Tanzania for the first time, using civic structures, using their own organisations, and gathered them online and through phones, and knocked on their doors and got a petition together, and they went to President Kikwete, who received them, and for the first time heard the farmers saying, dude, great policy, but
we expect you to implement.
And he listened, you know, and he said, okay, and we've helped to follow up on that with our African colleagues, and that's going to happen throughout. Public policy can't be made excluding the population. So at the moment, the countries are beginning to grow from very small levels. You know, let's not get overexcited. The African middle class, it's called a middle class because, you know, it's at a point where you're earning X amount of disposable income, surplus to what you need, but it's very low compared to the rest of the world. If you're an African middle class person and you go to Europe, you're not middle class, you're poor. But here you're middle class. But as the thing grows, the middle classes will demand participation in the political process, and nothing will stop that. That's the lesson of development. The good governments at work here now, the decent leaders, the good ones, and there are plenty on stream. You know, you might quibble about the type of government it is, but what's required for growth is leadership. People who aren't just thinking of their own pocket, but actually thinking about how can they make things better and change. So for people like Bono and myself and my friends who work on this, one, it's intellectually fascinating. Two, you live in this world. If you can participate in helping it just move a little better along the way, then great. And, you know, I fell into it by just watching the television one night and just thinking, well, the world doesn't have to be like that. And so for every African person watching this, the world doesn't have to be like the way you're living it. The world not only will change, change is necessary, change is almost always good, change could be accelerated, change is, you know, vital. And you know, the individual can absolutely change their own circumstances. You may feel hopeless, you might think, how do I start? How do I even change my family circumstances? Start talking with people who think like you.
Stay tuned for more from Bob Geldof.
Welcome back to the Africa Leadership Dialogues. Of course, Africa's top 10. But right now, let's get back to Sir Bob and his thoughts. Just still speaking to young people on the continent, what's your story? You're one of the most recognized faces in the world. Your voice is recognized. How did you achieve that? Was it easy, or did you work for it? What were the key steps mentally?
Well, I'm in rock and roll. That's my job. And Bono's my friend. He's Irish. He's the megastar. I'm the pop singer. And he was of a generation younger than me. And we came out of what was called the punk generation, which couldn't stand, which came out of social factors like most rock and roll. And if you listen to African music now, like here I was listening to Terry Afro and stuff like that last night, you know, who was put in jail for his last album because he got a little too political. But great, music should articulate now. That's the job. Look at the musicians, look at, our friend Gichuru Ndur, who wants to stand for, we've known Yusuf works with Bono and myself and all of this. He's always at the G8 with us. You know, Fela Kuti. It's the artists that articulate now, you know. So we came out of the punk thing. Ireland couldn't support its young people, so we all left. But that's betraying a generation. The job of government is to give a livelihood to the people of the country, especially the youth. So in Britain, the same thing was happening. And so there was this upsurge of anger, and it manifested itself in what was called punk music, you know, a rejection of all that. And so our songs were always about things. So 10 years on, it's great, lots of girls and screaming and selling records and big concerts. And one night at home, and I always watch the news, and I just had a little baby, my first little baby, and I turned on and saw these men and women in Ethiopia and children, no different to me, sitting at home in Chelsea and watching their children die. In our world, a world of surplus. So to die of want in a world of surplus is not only intellectually absurd, it is economically illiterate, and it's morally repulsive. So I got my friends in rock and roll. I wrote a song with a friend to do this song. So that's why myself and Bono are lucky. We can be on your television show. We can be on the radio. We can talk to the newspapers because we're in rock and roll. But if you're a farmer, if you're a plumber in America, and you're bothered about what you see on television, what can you do? I mean, if the plumber comes to fix my toilet, I'm lucky I have a toilet, and he starts talking to me about Africa, I'm saying, dude, fix the toilet, you know, please, forget about that, you know, yeah. And, but maybe he can talk to his friends, because this is what happened with Band-Aid, which was the record. People rang up and said, what can I do? And I said, what's your job? I'm a secretary. I said, do secretary aids. What's that? I don't know. And, you know, literally civil servants rang up, firemen rang up. And I said, I don't know, but just do something. And they'd gather together and do things. And that's how it started. We started making the argument. There was a generation came along who wanted to get involved in this. And gradually this momentum built up so that I still do the Band-Aid Trust, which spends the money from the record and the concerts, and we're going out to the border region now where there's hunger still. We'll do that in 3 days. Bono and myself and my friends over there started an organisation called One in 1999, which came out at the back of Drop the Debt, to cancel the debt for the poorest nations. We were always told we were naive. We were always told to go back to playing pop music. Hello? We're all doing cancellation these days. Europe's desperate to cancel the debt. Britain is driving itself into the ground in order to pay off its debt. America is paying off its debt. How naive were we? And how naive when Africa began to take off when the debt was cancelled. So the Drop the Debt movement was important. Out of that came this thing that we started called One, because we didn't feel there was enough voices in government. So we lobby. In Washington, we've got over 70 people who are now going to the G8. We go to all the G8s and we're allowed access into it. We've got 26 people in London, 6 in Berlin, 4 in Paris, 4 in Brussels, 10 in Africa. And we just get into the heart of government. We listen, we advise if we can, we try and steer policy, we try and focus on things. So you've got the humanitarian end, you've got the policy end. I'm with Kofi Annan on the Africa Progress Panel, which is to monitor African governments' progress and Western governments, and then part of the UN Millennium Development Goals. So that's it. That about covers the whole agenda. And would I do it if it wasn't working? No. But the fact is that we're here at this. Could I have imagined it? No. It's so great to have been a tiny part of this and to understand the next step now is the participation of the people of Africa, with their governments to the next step.
And you're going to leave a message for them. That's going to be the final thing. So you'll get to kind of give a one-on-one message on camera to the people of Africa. But just before we do that, African leadership, and you mentioned that there are some good leaders on this continent. And, what do you feel in this diverse, dynamic world that we have today are the greatest attributes for a good leader?
The job of a political leader is not to enrich yourself. That's the first thing. They have to understand that it's not an enriching opportunity. It's an opportunity to serve. It's an opportunity to make your people and the world a little better. And people go on about politicians, how crap they are. Certainly in my part of the world, it doesn't matter your political opinion, most of them have an idea that they can possibly make the world a better place. That's the truth. It may be naive. They might believe that their political ideology is the one to do it, but they do believe that, and then they get disillusioned by the parliamentary process. It's only through talking, negotiation, consensus, compromise, and cooperation that progress is made. If your political dynamic is competition, you will fail. And in the 21st century, it has never been truer because we now know that Ethiopia on its own can't do anything. Britain on its own can't do anything. Even America, which is still such a huge economy, far, far bigger than China's. I mean, immeasurably bigger than China's. No matter what people say, it's huge. America can't do anything on its own anymore on the great global problems, climate change, which affects this continent, where you have to have a major voice in its determination. Poverty, which I think is the single biggest issue, because if you eliminate poverty, you get education. We need smart people running countries, running the world. You get health. You can't have educated people if you don't have healthy people. If you have that, you get rid of conflict, because you talk things out. It is no use people invading another person for resources. You can share them. And if we don't share them, we're in trouble. The whole world is. So the problem is agriculture, feeding the world. We're in the middle of a food crisis. Now, food inflation in the West is stopping growth. It's stopping a revival of the economies, because the world is going to come to Africa, because the remaining 60% of arable land in the world here. But you need technologies, you need inputs, you need modern farming techniques, so you need us. So my song, I wrote the line, "Feed the world." That was the line I wrote. It's ironic, 30 years later, that Africa will be feeding the world. So we're coming here because we need you for the first time. That's the amazing thing. Again, 30 years ago, who'd have thought? Me and my friends have been saying it. It's inevitable that this will happen. I just didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime. I used to say by 2040, Africa will be one of the polar centres of economic growth on the planet. I didn't expect to see it in my lifetime, but I'm watching it happen now in front of my eyes.
It's really, really amazing. And finally, that message for Africans, what would you say to them? Look into the camera and just tell them from your heart what you think about Africa and moving forward.
So I'm talking to Africans. This is your century. If America was, if the 20th century was the American century, the 21st century will be the African century. People say China, I think the African century. So much determines what a century is. The art of a period, most of the great art of the 20th century came largely from America. I think that it'll come largely from Africa. I think the biggest growth will come out of the continent of Africa. China will reach a limit to growth. It's almost certainly, there's some part now. China needs to pull 800 million people out of poverty. China is rich, the Chinese are poor. I think Africans, just as the balance of population, you're very young, there's only 1 billion of you, you've got huge areas to expand in, you've got all the raw materials, but what Africa needs to focus on is its governance, its leaders. You need to produce from your young people, 60% of the continent is very young, educated people who just want the best for their people. And when you do that, then your life is better, you feel better about yourself. If you're poor still, if you're hungry still, don't despair. Now is the time when you can actively engage in doing something. Set up local communities, set up local NGOs, get together on your phones, get together on the internet, start talking about how you want to configure change, because it's going to happen very quickly, and you should be the ones who determine and frame that change that you want to see. Finally, in my lifetime, it's happened that whereas before Africa was a developmental burden, now you're the great opportunity for the world, and you deserve it.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Stay with the Africa Leadership Dialogues.
Years ago, Bob Geldof responded to a situation that really was none of his business, and he was able to make a difference. The question is, wherever we are, what can we do to make a difference? To ask yourself that question, then start the journey, if you haven't already, in making a difference.
To take part in our weekly hangouts, go to our G+ page, Africa Leadership Dialogues. On Facebook, Africa Leadership Dialogues. On Twitter, @AfricaLD.
This week, we asked you, in your own view, what impact does infrastructure have on the economy of a country? Crispin Winslow Crowe says, better roads facilitate the movement of goods and services across the country in the shortest time possible. They also attract investors because of lowered cost of production. This is wrapped up with an improved communication network. Shadrach Ngeno says, good infrastructure eases the movement of labor and goods from one place to another. This has a direct impact on economic growth. On Africa's Top 10 this week, we feature African countries leading in infrastructure according to the Global Competitiveness Report 2012-2013. Infrastructure value is out of 7 points. At number 10 is Liberia with an infrastructure value of 4.2 points and ranked at position 75 globally. Swaziland takes the number 9 slot with a global ranking of 73 and an infrastructure value of 4.2 points. Coming in at number 8 is Botswana. It's ranked at position 64 globally with an infrastructure value of 4.4 points. The Gambia comes in at number 7 with an infrastructure value of 4.5 points and ranking at position 63 globally. South Africa comes in at number 6 with a global ranking of 58 and an infrastructure value of 4.5 points. At number 5 is the island nation of Seychelles off the east coast of Africa. Their global ranking is 54 with an infrastructure value of 4.7 points. Still on the East African coast is another island nation. Mauritius comes in at number 4 with a global ranking of 53 and an infrastructure value of 4.7 points. Morocco stands at number 3 with a global ranking of 52 with an infrastructure value of 4.8 points. At number 2, we move back to the east of the continent. It's Rwanda with a global ranking of 48 and an infrastructure value of 4.9 points. Ranked at number 1 in Africa with a global ranking of 40 is Namibia with an infrastructure value of 5.1 points. That's Africa's Top 10 this week.
we've already come to the end of the show. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. I leave you this week with the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he said, creativity is the power to connect the seemingly unconnected. It is the power of creative man to perceive and to connect the seemingly unconnected. And perhaps if we start doing this in our everyday lives, we will slowly start to change the continent. It's been an absolute pleasure. Blessings to you and blessings to the African continent. I'm Gichuru. I'll see you again next week.